Hi, Bill here with Superior Driveline out of Des Moines, Iowa. Today I'm going to show you the installation of our driveshaft disconnect and how it installs in the Toyota Tacoma that we have here today. So we can do this two different ways. We have the driveshaft where we build it complete with our coupling welded into it and it's balanced, and we guarantee it to be vibration free, so it'll just replace the factory driveshaft in the vehicle. But if you do find out that there is a mismeasurement or some other issue, please give us a call right away so we can get that taken care of for you. The other way that we have it is we can do our coupling kit and have the driveshaft work done locally by a driveshaft shop where they can install the stub, which is welded into the tubing, the yoke, and the collar that sits over the two halves, and that's what operates disengaging and engaging the coupling. The other pieces that come with our coupling is the shifter mechanism that bolts right onto the nose of the rear end, or differential, and that's the rear differential. It doesn't go at the other end at the transmission end. It always goes back at the rear differential. The other piece that comes in the coupling kit is our shift cable. The handle mounts up in the driver's compartment right below the driver's right leg on the floor, and then the cable runs through the floorboard back to the differential where it connects to the shifter mechanism to shift it in and out of gear. These are a 10-foot cable, which normally will work on any vehicle. We do have our longer cables that we can use if there is a longer vehicle, such as a Sprinter van or Ford Transit van. But 9 times out of 10, this shift cable will take care of it, and it does a great job. And then most important is our instruction book. This is step by step to do the installation. Each one of them come with this instruction book. Also in the center section we have a supplement that is specific for mounting our shifter mechanism to the differential, and it specifically talks about how to mount this shifter to that particular differential, whether it's on this Toyota Tacoma that we're doing today, or a Ford F-150, or a Nissan Frontier. That supplement's going to be specific for that vehicle's differential. So the three components that we got is the spline yoke, the spline stub that welds into the driveshaft tubing, and the spline collar, and that sits over the two halves. The collar, and then that yoke. Alright, so there's the three parts put together, and this collar is what holds both of those pieces together. We do have a bolt that runs down through the center of it that bolts to the stub, and that's where that sits over the two halves, and then it spins as it's being towed. So when it's in the disengaged position and you're towing the vehicle behind the motorhome, the rear end or differential is turning and it spins on the sealed bearing. Once we have the three components put together, then that collar slides across the splines and locks that into place, and it's just like a regular drive shaft when it's all locked up. So you don't have to worry about having that engage or disengage on you. The shifter mechanism that we mount on the differential, it's to shift this collar. It doesn't do anything else except shift it. It doesn't hold the collar because those spring-loaded ball bearings are holding it, and that's what we have to hold that into place. Either we can send the complete drive shaft with the disconnect, or we can send the coupling on different vehicles where we do have to modify it to the factory drive shaft. We can send the coupling and it can be welded into the existing tubing of the factory drive shaft. That way you can use your drive shaft over again if you'd like, or we can build the complete drive shaft and save your drive shaft. If you ever want to put it back in the vehicle, you can do that also. Once you install that drive shaft, we mount the shifter, and this is one of the most important parts here, is having this shifter mounted correctly and adjusted so it shifts in and out of gear properly. And during our installation on the Toyota Tacoma, I will show you how that is done properly, so we can adjust our bolts here and get the shift fork so it shifts that collar back and forth in and out of gear. If it's not adjusted right, it does make it difficult to shift that collar across the splines. If one block is hitting before the other, it's not going to want to go in and out of gear very easily, and the customer has to pull on that cable pretty hard, and it shouldn't have to be that way if it's adjusted right. The cable should just move in and out of gear, shifting this fork back and forth across the splines. Today we're doing an installation on a 15 Toyota Tacoma. It has a two-piece drive shaft and it's a four-wheel drive. So on this it has a male-female slip with the drive shaft disconnect with the rear. And on all of our installations we do have the disconnect going at the rear end at all times. It never does go up at the front end at the transmission or transfer case. Superior Driveline has built a complete drive shaft from flange up to U-joint at the front by the carrier bearing here. We build this as a complete unit because we have better control over our balancing and making sure that there's no vibration issues. When we do this, we have it in phase. The U-joints are always going to be in phase with each other to eliminate any vibration issues. And on this particular drive shaft, it does have a male-female slip where if it was pulled apart, it could be phased in a position that's going to cause a vibration. So we want to make sure that our U-joints are in phase and we have no issues there. With the splined collar setup, it has two wide splines that allow us to keep those U-joint yokes in phase. And if we disengage it, we can turn it at 180 degrees out and it'll lock into the other position. But again, we go right back to our yokes and U-joints are in phase with each other at both ends. So with that in mind, we want to take it out for a test drive, make sure that we don't have any vibration issues before we even talk about putting our shifter mechanism on. So if we can take it out onto the interstate, it'd be best, so where we can get it up to 75, 80 miles an hour, just to make sure that 0 up to 80 we are in good shape, there's no vibrations. Then we can come back and continue on with our installation. We want to make sure that the collar, being new, that it is going to engage and disengage properly. Sometimes being new, there may be some burrs or something that hang it up and it doesn't want to shift back and forth with your hand, but it should be able to shift easily back and forth. If we have issues, we can take WD-40 spray or a brake cleaner, works great, and just really wash it well underneath the splines of the collar and try to wash anything out that might be in there and continue trying to move it back and forth. Underneath this collar, it has the spring-loaded ball bearings, and that's what holds the collar into position for driving in the engaged or towing in the disengaged position. And those springs and balls need to be able to move freely up and down so that collar rides across the detents and locks into place. The next step is doing our installation for the shifter mechanism, which is going to shift this collar, it disengaging and engaging. What we have is a mechanical cable system that has the linkage mounted on the rear end that shifts the collar in and out of gear, and the cable that runs up underneath the floorboard and comes out through the floorboard into the seat right below the driver's right leg on the floor. This allows the driver to disengage the drive shaft right from the seat, and he doesn't have to climb underneath it. It's all done at the driver's seat for disengaging and engaging. This portion of the installation is where it takes the time, because we want to get it mounted correctly and adjusted so it shifts this collar in and out of gear properly. We have the shifter mechanism itself that mounts right on the bottom of the differential. We have the U-bolt that goes over the top of the differential and bolts it down securely to the differential. There's the shift fork with the shift blocks that sit in the collar, and these shift blocks are what shifts the collar back and forth in and out of gear. Once we're ready to do this, we want to take a look at our shifter mounted on the differential, and we want to keep in mind we have these two welded saddles that act as our teeter-totter point and allow us to move our shifter up and down, front to back, to get our blocks located center into the collar. We have an adjustable saddle on the back that gives us fine-tuning adjustment to get it mounted so it's secure to the differential. So what we're going to do is we're going to put this shifter and get the shift block sitting up into the collar and have the saddles that are welded in there sitting up against there. So with our shifter mechanism, we have the U-bolt and our hardware bag that has all of the clamps and screws necessary to assemble this to the differential, attach the cable to the shifter mechanism, and it also has the bracket for mounting the cable handle up by the driver's seat. On the shifter we have a zip tie that holds the linkage in the rearward position, and this is to help the installer put the shift fork up in the collar position so we can get that sitting correctly. And it is with the collar in the engaged position that we need to have this for installation. We don't want the collar in the disengaged, it needs to be engaged. So we have the shift blocks up in there, and we can hold our index finger between the shift fork and the collar, so this way we can get our distance pretty close with the blocks halfway up in the collar, and we can see exactly where we need to go with the saddles that mount on the differential. Okay, we get this mounted up there with the shift blocks halfway up in the collar, and this way we have the front welded saddles right on the front edge of the nose of the differential. We can then see where the rear saddle needs to sit. Well, when we put it up here and take a look, we have a casting web or a support web that is making it hard for us to get our rear saddle to sit level. But it makes it nice because we can notch this web right here and have this saddle sit even with the bottom of the differential on the main casting. We'll notch this, but we don't want to go deeper than the main housing. We'll just go even with it, so that way our rear saddle will sit level on the bottom, and I'll have Dave mark where we need to make that notch. And as you can see here, we have the notch made, and it's level with the casting of the main housing. We don't want to go any deeper or else we're going to hit oil. So then we try putting this back up again. And now that's given us the clearance to give that rear adjustable saddle sitting level on the bottom, and then our two welded towers are not touching. So what we're going to do here to get this to sit level and have the saddles touching properly, we have the washers in here that allow us to move it up and down. We'll remove those to give it the clearance, and then we can go from there. On these installations, we do see variances with the castings of the differential. So that's why we do give it an adjustable point that we can make it where you can remove it or adjust it side to side to allow those to fit up there tighter and properly for each differential. Okay, so now I took out a set of washers there to lower that saddle down a little bit, and I'm going to leave these nuts loose so this way we can move our adjustable saddle side to side to get adjustment there also. So we do have the side to side movement, and we also have the washers to give it the height adjustment. So we'll give this another try on the differential now. Okay, so now we have the front saddles that are touching against the differential there, and that's our teeter-totter point to give it the movement there. And we have our rear saddle sitting into position there. So now what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that this U-bolt is lined up correctly with the holes in the shifter so we can see where we need to make our notches for the webbing on this side of the differential. So what I do is we run this up through here, and you can get this lined up, and on this particular one we're only going to have to make a notch in this center one. We may have to do a little bit here, but we can tell that different when we drop the U-bolt down the other direction. But running it upside down like this, we're able to see where that has to sit. So now that we've got the U-bolt around the nose of the differential, we can tighten that up and we can see where our saddles are sitting up in against the differential. Our U-bolt is sitting in the notch that we made over here on the passenger side, and we can tighten that up. And what we're wanting to do is get a close setting for our shift fork so that the shift blocks are fairly close into the halfway point of the collar. We do have two nuts on both sides that we can do our fine tuning, and that way we can get it adjusted so the shift blocks are hitting the collar at the same time, and we can shift that back and forth just like we were doing it by hand. We'll be able to do it with the linkage once we get this adjusted. So now we're going to take a look at the shift blocks and make sure that they are sitting in the collar halfway. If we need to, we can loosen these two nuts, which in the instructions it's bolts A on each side. The arms that hold the shift fork, the pivot arms, have slotted holes, and it allows the loosening of those nuts, and then the arms can pivot up and down or front to back to get our fine-tune adjustments on the shift blocks so they hit in the collar evenly, and it slides the collar across the splines effortlessly. So we've got this sitting level now, and we can go ahead and cut our zip tie so we don't have that in our way, since that gave us our adjustment or our location to mount the U-bolt. So we'll cut this off, and then we'll check the shifting of the linkage here. Okay, now that I've cut the zip tie, we can, kind of see what we're having to deal with here. It isn't shifting real smooth, so you can tell that we've probably got a shift block that's hitting the collar before the other one does, or the blocks aren't exactly halfway up in there. So we'll go ahead and do some fine tuning here now with the bolts A. There's two on each side, so we can loosen those and make sure that we get them adjusted correctly. But this shift block is hitting on the back edge of the collar, and my shift block on the driver's side is hitting the front of the collar. So what it's doing is putting a bind on it. So I'm going to loosen the bolts A on each side, and that way I can adjust the arms to get those blocks so they're centered in the collar and they'll hit the collar at the same time. So you don't have to take these loose all the way, but just enough that you can move the arms. You don't want to get it too loose to where the arms just fall and you can't keep it in place. So if you just loosen them enough that you can, use a tool or a hammer or just tap it so you can get those so it'll shift evenly. So as you can see here, we're getting this where it's shifting back and forth a lot easier now. So I can start tightening these up a little bit, but we want to make sure that we keep those centered up in there. If the shift blocks are sitting too low, it'll twist the collar the other direction, the up and down direction, or if one of the blocks hit before the other block does, it'll twist it side to side. So we just want to get those blocks centered so it shifts that collar straight across those splines as evenly as possible. It'll just make it easier when we do hook the cable up, that you'll be able to pull it out and push it in, pull it out, push it in, and it'll work simply for you. And sometimes in manufacturing with the shift fork, these two vertical arms that hold the blocks, when they weld those together in their fixtures, they can be bent just a little bit in, or so where they're pinching the inside of the collar. So we just want to take a look and make sure that they don't pinch the inside, the front, or the back side, and that'll help the blocks last a lot longer. And looking at this one, we need to bend this arm over a little bit because there's no daylight in that block there at all. This one's sitting really nice. So once we have it adjusted, we can shift that in and out of gear. Then we can tighten those bolts A back down into their position. So we know that we have it adjusted correctly now. When this drive shaft's spinning, it's going to spin around those shift blocks. And if we have it so they're floating in there, for one thing, they aren't going to wear down and you won't have to replace them all the time. The other is if it's rubbing up against there, there's a good chance that you might hear a squealing while you're driving it. So if we get that adjusted so they're just floating, it'll just bounce in there because they're held on with the springs, and they'll just float and bounce as you're driving the vehicle. Okay, so we're going to go over what we've just done now and just do a little recap for you. We've got the drive shaft installed, and we have the linkage mounted and adjusted. It's on there firm on the rear end. We've got the adjustments made here with the shift blocks. The shift fork shifts in and out of gear. This is one of the steps that we want to make sure. Earlier we took a hold of the collar and made sure that the collar was sliding across the splines easily. Now we make sure that the linkage is shifting the collar across the splines easily. When we're all done with this, we're going to know that the cable is working just as smoothly. So that's going to be our next step now, is mounting the cable, running it through the floorboard, mounting the handle up at the driver's seat, and coming back here and adjusting the cable for when we're driving it down the road and it is allowed to move up and down. And so we'll do that installation now. Okay, we're going to start the installation on the cable now, and we'll run that through the floorboard. And what we want to do here is have the cable running straight down the middle of the vehicle. And we want the handle at the middle of the vehicle so it runs straight down and we don't have any curves or bends in it that puts a bind on the cable. So when we're doing that, we definitely don't want to have it sitting here on the outside of the seat, because it's going to have to run into the middle of the vehicle somewhere and we're going to have a bind on it. What we do is we mount it right under the driver's right leg. That way it goes through the floorboard and straight down the middle of the truck. So right now we have the seat in the most rearward position, and with this particular pickup it even has a hump here, or a high ridge. We're going to install the handle right in the middle of the floorboard here, in the middle of the vehicle, so it's right below the driver's right leg. This way the cable is running through the floorboard straight back to the shifter mechanism at the rear end, or differential. We have the bracket where it has different angle that you can mount that right on the floor. So then basically your handle is pointing right at the gas pedal. Once we have that location figured out, which we can, do it here, we can even do it on the side of the hump of the vehicle where the transmission hump is. Then we want to determine where we can go through the floorboard, and with this hump that allows it to be able to go right through here with the cable, or we can even punch a hole more in front of the seat here. That allows it to go through and angle straight to the back also. Once we have that mounted where we want, then we just need to determine 6 or 8 inches behind there where we can punch that hole. We take the punch, or a drill will work if we have to do it that way, but the punch makes it easier. You don't grab carpeting. It just makes it easier to go through a double wall floor. And we have made a homemade punch that's 16, 18 inches long, and you can get your hammer in here and you can just punch a nice hole right through the floor. So once we've determined where we're going to go with that, we can take a look at the flooring and tell that, okay, right here in the middle there is some wiring, so we want to stay away from wiring. If there's any air ducts that we need to avoid going back to the rear seats, but in this case, you can just feel that the floor is solid right there. So we're going to go ahead and punch that hole, and then we'll run that cable through there. We have the installation of the cable that we're going to do right now, and it's going to run straight down the middle of the vehicle through the floorboard and come back here to the shifter linkage. And on this particular vehicle with the Toyota, we have the linkage on the passenger side because we have a gas tank over on the driver's side that's real close to the differential and drive shaft. We do have the exhaust muffler over here on the passenger side, but there is a lot more room. So as we run the shift cable back, we're going to just run it underneath the cab of this pickup and on the floorboard and cross over the drive shaft to get over here to this linkage on the passenger side. Supplied in our hardware bag, we have the hardware with clamps, and there's 3 of the rubber clamps that we want to tighten down underneath the bed of the pickup, and if there's any cross members or right to the floorboard of the pickup, we can use these black coated clamps. This will clamp it down rigid. When we come through the floorboard, we don't need to have any movement at all. It just needs to be rigid from where it comes through the floor to about the last 18 or 20 inches before it connects to the shifter. So as we do this, we're going to take our clamps and just put them around. Each one goes 12, 14 inches apart, and we have in the hardware bag our self-tapping screws that we can just screw it right into a cross member or to the floorboard and make that cable as rigid as possible. So when it's rigid and you're pulling on the cable, it'll just slide back and forth. When we get down here to the last 18 or 20 inches, we need to watch how the routing is. We don't want the cable taut. We want to have it with a little bit of a bow. This way, when this shifter cable is attached to the linkage and the rear end is moving up and down, it allows for this bow to give and take right in this area, and we don't have it pulling on the linkage. What will happen if you have it too tight on the linkage is it'll pull on this and it'll pull it out of gear, and you'll coast over to the side of the road, which is not a good thing. So we want to make sure we do have that cable adjusted right. Okay, now once we have the outer housing of it clamped underneath the floorboard, we can go down here to the end of it where we have our T-bracket that holds the cable, and there's a fourth clamp, and it's not coated. It's a stainless steel clamp that it has notches built into it, so then when you do clamp it down, it squeezes the outer housing of the cable, and that holds it tight when it's sitting in this bracket. So I'm going to go ahead and mount this clamp for you, and then we'll go on to the next step. Once we have this clamping the outer housing, we're going to be able to trim it to the exact length. Because we want to remember that we send one length of cable, it's 10 feet long, so it's going to just depend on the vehicle, but 9 times out of 10 you're going to have to cut it to the correct length. And the way to do that is we don't want to cut the inner cable, but we have to cut the outer housing to the correct length. So we're going to go up to the other end of the cable, pull the handle out to pull that inner cable out of the way, so then we can cut our outer housing here in the appropriate place. So Dave, if you want to move that cable out, on this here, we want to run the housing past the cable about 3/4 to an inch past it. Then that end of the housing, it has a rubber tip on it, and it seals the inner cable from water and dust, and it keeps it just nice and tight. So we're going to put that back on the end of it, and when we do that, we can have Dave push the cable back in, and we'll get that the correct length then. Okay, we'll slide that seal back on there, and we have that in place. So now we've got the clamp on here with it clamped down, and those tabs are biting into the outer housing. We have the rubber seal on it. Now we can get our linkage hooked up here for our cable. So you can see what we have now is we have the end of it sticking past here. We're going to be putting in the fitting that has a barrel nut and the washer and the screw to hold that in there. And in the instruction book, it does show the appropriate way to mount that in there, and we'll go ahead and do that now. Okay, so we have the 3 pieces of our fitting, and it's the barrel nut, the screw with the concave washer. So if we put the screw in through the barrel nut that has the hex head on that side of the barrel nut, then we just slide that into the linkage there. Then we have the concave washer, and we just put the concave washer on that opposite side of the arm. And I'm going to hold that there, and I'm going to go up into the cab, and I'll pull the cable so then we can put the cable through that fitting. And at this point, we want to keep this nut and bolt loose here, so then that way we can get the correct angle for that cable to come down and be able to pull it evenly. Okay, so now we have that inner cable going through the fitting, and here is a very important step that we want to make sure is you can pull this cable back and forth, but we want to go up to the other end where the handle is and make sure that the handle does not sit flush against the bracket. We need to have 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch space between the handle and the bracket, and that allows for the rear end, when it moves, it'll pull on this cable a little bit. When it does, it'll be able to give up there at the handle. If we have the handle flush up against that bracket, when the rear end drops and it pulls on this, there's no place for that handle to go, and it's going to come out of gear and disengage here, and you're going to coast off to the side of the road. And we can now tighten down this fitting to hold this inner cable into position. So with the nut driver, you can screw that down and have that down just tight so we have good movement. So once we have that all set up, then we can take the side cutters and cut off the excess so we don't have as much. Now that we have the cable tightened down here, we have the seal put on the outer housing. We have this clamp tightened down so it's in line. We have the bow in our cable. We can let the vehicle down now, and we should be able to pull the lever in and out, since we've made sure that the collar was sliding easily when we first started. When we had the linkage hooked up, we could move it by hand. We can even move it by hand with just the cable hooked up at this end. So we do know we have everything adjusted correctly. So if we let the vehicle down, then we'll be able to do the cable right from the driver's seat, and that'll finish our installation, and we'll be able to tow this vehicle on all 4 wheels with no issues.